obviously much later, but by then they were still making beer, and it was getting more and more refined from the Bronze Age. By here, you can see some of these early ones. Zythos again, moving to foam. They talk some of their writing what beer is not inferior to wine in some situations. So it was actually apparently pretty decent. Here's Strabo barley beer. Its preparation, particularly to the Egyptians, it is common to many tribes, but the mode of preparing it differs in each. So obviously there's not one standard method, but likely it was using the same ingredients for the most part. How long the duration of fermentation, etc. happens, we don't know all the idiosyncrasies. Certainly by then, we were refining this process more and more. You have a whole bunch of iconography. In fact, you notice here, this is very similar to this one. But it's sitting in these, they seem to be kind of stands. And this is something that I actually have realized subsequently after this. I wanted a flat bottom just for the purposes of transportation. Turns out, actually, after I've been using this a couple of times now, what happens is you actually start to get mold growth on the bottom when this is full of beer, or when it's fermented. And that is because there's no airflow through here. So I think what they were doing, and they figured this probably quite early on, they had these round bottom vessels, quite thick, so that it wouldn't leach through. Probably the first time, we don't know how they sealed it, as in, because it's porous, right? So there will be a certain amount of leaching into the surrounding body. But the first time I did that, it leached through a little bit, started to see it come through. The second time it didn't, so I think it sealed it enough. And now the third time, we'll see how well it responds. But what happens at the bottom, I think what I'm going to do now is actually elevate it so that there's airflow through, so that there's no microclimate underneath here that will cause mold growth of bacteria, which will then spoil the beer. So I think they realized quite early on that they could elevate that and come through with airflow and it wouldn't spoil it. Again, I mean, you get quite a bit of interesting iconography. You get pouring scenes, production scenes, some of the vessels here, even vomiting scenes. People being carried, after one too many. Quite a few brewing models have been found, and not a lot of these are necessarily in the context, but especially ones in museums. So, they end up showing up in people's collections. In Victorian, even earlier, sort of collecting these. But obviously, what they show in wood form is the production of both bread and beer, and that's kind of part and parcel to production of beer, likely the byproduct. But you do both, and in many cases, it was women who were actually the brewers, certainly in Kasi in Mesopotamia, showing female deity. Elevating female to that level, obviously, like, women were the primary producers of beer. Well, that's changed now. Here you see an early site, actually, in Upper Egypt, Naga there, these large vessels that are known to be used for beer production. Just based on iconography and some residue analysis, this is actually a typical area of that period too. It's the British Museum, one of those vessels. So you get feasting. Obviously, you're sending this loved one to the afterlife with everything they would need on the journey. They may have been involved in actually the ritual consumption of that alcohol or beer while they were being buried. We don't know, but likely that would happen. Here's another site. This is actually Hierakonpolis. Who was the previous speaker? It was just last semester. Somebody, who was here speaking about Hierakonpolis. And I asked him afterwards about this particular area of the site, the Vax site. And Jeremy Geller excavated this. He went back this last year, and tried to find this area again. It was unsuccessful, but fortunately they did a good job in excavating it. Maybe too good of the fact that you can't find it anymore. But you can see, what was here, quite a bit of evidence here, substantial evidence of brewing activities, carbonized brewing and large vats, dated here, calibrated very early, over 5,000 years. So here is kind of a reconstruction. There were large vats that were here used, I think, for fermentation. Both the site, I mean, there was likely, this is the reconstruction, would have had a low, just to allow, so there was rain falling on it. But they probably wanted it open so that there was natural yeast flowing around from the harvest that fell into the fermentation jars, open fermentation, that would render it an alcoholic beverage. Here's another site, Middle Kingdom, so we'll move further down to the Nile. Another recent, actually, excavation here. There's some evidence here of actually these vats too that were found. There was carbonized grain. Armana, obviously, where this fella here, Akhenaten, decided to call his new kingdom the capital of Egypt. So, yeah, this is another site that is often talked about for parallel brick chambers, ovens indicating molds that were used for both baking and brewing. So again, when you're having a lot of these sites that you see are kind of also connected to sacred temples where you would have beer for the production of the ritual use within a sacred environment. It comes from the domesticated home environment, and then over time really becomes obviously a mass-produced item expected in sacred contexts. Further down the Nile here, now on the delta, even earlier here, a very early site, again, evidence of brewing these large jars that they were actually used for storage of beer, but also what was considered a clover-leaf shape, actual brewery style. It wasn't enormous, but enough that they think they could have produced quite a bit of beer on a daily basis, and that was actually a Polish team that recently excavated that not too long ago. So, a lot of this, once they do subsequent analysis and publish, we'll get a lot more information from this site, but one of the activities obviously associated with this site is brewing. We'll move into Turkey, much later, Iron Age now. And again, Dogfish Head is back on the scene, and some of you may have had Midas touch. King Midas was buried in this tumulus at Gordion. I guess it's sitting behind here. So I think it's up there, right? And you know where Turkey is. Essentially central, not central Turkey. But he was outfitted with a whole variety of vessels, paraphernalia, both for the consumption of the ritual feast, on burial, for the afterlife, and everything you would need along the way. Again, buried on quite a large bed here. Within one of these vessels, actually, was, again, more residue that University of Pennsylvania ended up trying to recreate and figured out what the ingredients were. In this case, it was muscat grapes, thyme, honey, saffron, barley, and of course yeast and water. So this is quite a very good beer. How accurate it is, we don't know again, but it's hitting. We're trying to get as close as we can to accessing the taste. Certainly, to get to elites like this, certainly their beer probably was of a higher quality that would have had other more expensive ingredients in it. Okay, Neolithic Europe now. We have up here Sikaru. Evidence now recently that has been thankfully grad students who need something to write about and looking at pottery pieces and with a bit of luck, you might come across some residue, and certainly on some of this cordware, there's now a suggestion that beer production wasn't that. That's based on the calcium oxalate and some of the other residues. But they're interesting. I mean, this is a very interesting site. Kind of a new created village, multi-purpose, certainly large production of food, grinding stones and things like that. But within this now, they're thinking actually, I think it was within this corner that it was perhaps evidence of beer. If it's on the storage jars, it's perhaps being produced right on site, very likely. Bell beakers, now this is a little bit later in time as they move kind of from the east toward the west. Bell beaker